Bonjour à tous. Good morning. Good morning, Ross. Good morning, Ben. The next presentation will be in English. And sorry for my English. But because we are really happy to have Dr. Ross Tucker and Professor Ben Jones with us this morning. I'm not sure everyone knows you, but I think we could introduce you as two rock stars in the field of sports science, and in particular in rugby science. Ross, you are a science and research consultant for World Rugby, and your role is to support strategic decisions that involve player welfare, high performance, and law. You are also known as a co-host of the Real Science of Sport podcast that we should all follow and listen. And last but not least, Ross, you regularly ask to put up with my poor English at player load project group meetings organized by World Rugby. Sorry for that. Ben, you are a professor at Leeds Beckett University and also a strategic lead for performance science and research in the Rugby Follow League, Rugby Football Union, and World Rugby. And in this context, you have been spearheading the research on instrumented mouthguards, the IMG, in Rugby Union. Both are producing a lot of research on IMG and are two world-leading experts on it. And to finish, before I let you continue, Ben, your English. And as you might expect, few English people are allowed to come here in our little Gallic village. In French, we say village Gaulois. And if I am Asterix, I'm curious to know who could be Obelix. Maybe Olivier has any idea? I don't know. So, but to my knowledge, you were the first to introduce the term co-opetition in sports science, and which, in short, means that we can be in competition, but some issues are too big, too critical for each of us to work on alone. It seems to me that preventing the potential negative effects of impacts, both in the short and especially long-term on rugby player health is the case. Once again, a big thanks to both of you for taking time today to present the recent advances in this field. Thanks. So let's go.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you, Julian, Olivier, and the FFR for the invitation. I actually came here 8 years ago with Cedric, who was one of my PhD students, one of my first PhD students, so it's great to come back. I'm going to be talking today about instrumented mouthguards and the emergence of a weapon to attack an unseen enemy. The talk will be in the style of Asterix, Obelix, and the dog. That's me, Ross, and my dog Baxter. By the end, you can decide who's who. So let's start by talking about what is the enemy and what is the weapon. So the first thing that we need to think about is how important do we think the enemy is? And if we think about this on a sliding scale, everyone in the room will sit somewhere different in terms of high importance or low importance. So if we work along the bottom axis, let's say subclinical head accelerations are important for player health. We know concussion is important. We know we diagnose, recognise, remove players with concussions. But what about the head impacts or head accelerations that don't result in concussion? How important are they? Is it small ones, big ones? And then along the vertical axis, the weapon. Technology can accurately measure head acceleration events. So if you sat in this room, you can think about where you sit in terms of, is there an enemy and is there a good weapon? And this becomes more complex when I ask the question on the bottom axis, subclinical head accelerations are important for player health in the short and longer term. So if the research suggests that more head impacts increases the potential risk of negative brain health outcomes in later life, how do we deal with that and who deals with that? So you're a coach, you have a player, and head impacts may increase the risk in 30 years' time. It's complex, right? So let's think about this as a Rubik's Cube, okay? If we think about that three-dimensional graph, and everyone in the room needs to sit somewhere, whether they think head impacts are important, whether they think the mouth guard works, and whether they think whether it's short or long term. And you can kind of position yourself in one of the cubes on the Rubik's Cube. But we also know that a Rubik's Cube isn't straightforward. And it takes a lot of things to line it up so that we get all the colours to align. So this is probably the start point for where we are in terms of head impacts, head acceleration events, short and long-term health outcomes, and then a tool to accurately measure them. World Rugby led the rollout of this globally, probably 3 years ago. And after they rolled out the instrumented mouth guards across numerous unions, and then Rugby League in England also did similar, we surveyed the instrumented mouth guard users, and we asked them a number of questions. The graphs you can see on the screen have broadly two different colours, green and brown. Okay? We asked them different questions, and green was they agreed, brown was they disagreed. So green is good, brown is bad. Okay? So we asked them, are groups interested in instrumented mouth guards? So you can see and then there's 4 different bars. Bar 1 is women's rugby union players. Bar 2 is women's rugby league players. Bar 3 is men's rugby union players. Bar 4 is men's rugby league players. So we can see there's differences in interest in the instrumented mouth guard data between coaches, medical staff, players, between staff in men's and women's, rugby league and rugby union. So you can start to see how from the Rubik's Cube, all the colours aren't on the same side just yet. So the interest was the graph that's in the big spot. You can see that. So medical staff were more interested. Men's rugby league players were the least interested in the data. And then the other graphs that you can see on the other side were around, is instrumented mouth guard data used for training? Is it used for rehab, etc.? So you can see that actually the early adoption was quite limited. And then you go back to the matrix. Either it was the believability of the mouth guard, or it was the enemy that we were trying to fight. So if we start with the technology can accurately measure head acceleration events, let's ask ourselves 3 questions. When a visible head impact occurs, does the instrumented mouth guard report one? When an instrumented mouth guard reports a head acceleration event, did a visible impact occur? And are the data reported by the IMG valid? If we understand the answers to these 3 questions, I think our confidence in the weapon can increase or decrease. The answer to question 1. So we did a validity study probably 3 years ago, and we've just repeated it, which was a collaboration with the French Rugby Union as well. And we looked at, for every time the instrumented mouth guard reported a head acceleration event, did a visible impact occur? Okay, so in our cohort of rugby union, rugby league players, men and women, of over 1,200 events, only 3 were false positives. So our PPV, our positive predictive value, for the instrumented mouth guard is 1. So we can be confident that when the instrumented mouthguard reports a head acceleration event, a head impact does occur for both men and women. And the second part for this question, which is more complex, is when an impact occurs, when we see this, does the mouthguard report? Now, one of the broader challenges with this concept is the mouthguard has a trigger threshold. So it doesn't record all head acceleration events. It only records head acceleration events that go above a certain trigger threshold. But we can't visually see what that threshold is. So what we did here was a video analyst identified every time there was a visible head impact. And our assumption was if there's a visible head impact, the instrumented mouthguard should record that. And what we saw of in our data was that for the head acceleration events that we saw on camera, 188 of those were in the men were true positive. 11 of those were false negative. Sorry, they're false negative, and in the women, 90 were true positive and 7 were false negative. So the sensitivity of the instrumented mouthguard for recording head impacts is over 0.9 for men and about 0.9 for women. So that's good. So I would say that our start point, based on where we are now, if you think about where you position yourself on this graph, you should be climbing that y-axis. Compared to previous sensors, so skin patches or sensors embedded within helmets, the instrumented mouthguard can accurately measure head acceleration events. And then we also looked at this in the laboratory. So this was a collaboration with Virginia Tech in the USA, Professor Steve Rosen, and we looked at the instrumented mouthguard's ability to record a head impact against a dummy head form, against a criterion sensor. And we can see here, so we've got 6 graphs. The first column is peak linear acceleration, the instrumented mouthguard's ability to look at the head acceleration forward and back, peak angular acceleration, rotation, and then peak angular velocity. So peak linear acceleration, very good. There was some noise in the angular acceleration, and that seems like that comes from one of the test conditions, and peak angular velocity was very good. So again, we can be confident that in the lab that these mouthguards are reporting what they should. But there's something more complex than this around anything that's not everything in the lab is the same in the field. Agree? And the green and red bars that you can see on the right-hand side was from the first study we did a few years ago, where we looked at 4 different instrumented mouthguards. And you can see that based on the y-axis is peak linear and peak angular acceleration, so magnitude of impact. And you can see that for the different instrumented mouthguards, they were all reporting very different values, which is a challenge. Because if we want to know the magnitude of head impacts for rugby players on a pitch, because we know they're important, we need to make sure that the mouthguard is reporting the right data. So the early data showed that there were differences between the instrumented mouthguards. If you move left now to the black data, this is from the more recent study, we can now start to see that the kinematics that we see on the field are similar to what we see in the lab. So we're confident in this. And of note for anyone that's involved in rugby union that looks at the instrumented mouthguard as a trigger, if you can see well, they're small, but there's some red dots on the black. And the red dots are the false positives. The false positives are low magnitude events. They're not the high magnitude events. So it's unlikely that the trigger would come from a false positive. So this is because the instrumented mouthguard is trying to not miss events that maybe if a player changes direction quickly and their head moves, that may record as a head acceleration event when it wouldn't have been based on our criteria. So that's part one of the instrumented mouthguard, the technology and the journey we've gone on for the validity. I'm going to now pass back to Asterix or Obelix, still to debate, who's going to talk through where we are, where World Rugby are at with the instrumented mouthguard data, and then I'll talk about some future direction.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen and then talk you through a few things from the World Rugby perspective about how this all happened. And it's crazy to think it was 5 years ago now, during the lockdown of COVID, that we first started to take the first steps on this particular journey, because we had an opportunity, because there was no rugby happening at that time. And so it gave us the first chance we'd had to sit down and pause and say, what will really matter in the next 5 or 6 years? And it was at coincidentally the same time that these instrumented mouthguards were becoming more available and cheaper. And so we looked at them as one of our key potential tools that was going to help us answer some important questions. And those are the questions that I want to try and explain and introduce to you today. The title of the talk is Full Contact, and I think if there's one thing that you remember from this talk, it's that the mouthguard is about far more than concussion. In the elite game, we've introduced the mouthguard as a way of trying to support concussion diagnosis and management. But that's actually a very small part of what we are trying to do with it. There is a much, much bigger picture. And Ben has spoken to you about that when he introduced the enemy earlier on. And it's those head contacts that don't cause concussion. Those are the ones that we are more worried about. And so if you think of position, why are we interested in instrumented mouthguards? If you are looking to try and understand a picture, you can do it in different ways. But imagine you go to the museum and you stand really, really close to a painting, and all you can see is one tiny pixel on that painting. Now, you don't really know where that pixel fits. You don't have any idea of how it makes up the picture, but it's still important. And in the context of brain and IMG, this is the most significant head acceleration event. So we can look at the very, very, very small pixels that are the concussions, the head injury assessments, the cases that are noticeable. Like, that's the pixel. But then what you do is you take one step backwards and you try and look at more pieces of this picture. And so you now arrive at grids. In the context of the mouthguards, those grids are things like, can we use the mouthguard to manage player load? Can we use it to measure contact and then optimize contact so that we can prepare players for matches in training? Can we identify technical changes for players that might reduce brain strain in order to defend performance? So that's the medium term. And then we take a step even further back, and now the picture starts to come even more into view because we can see frames. And in our context, the frame is how many head impacts does a player experience over the course of their entire career. And so what I'm trying to illustrate with this concept is that you can use the mouthguards in different ways, depending on how much detail and how close you want to get. But from World Rugby's perspective, our thinking is that in the public health model, you're trying to understand something in order to fix it. You measure it and then you manage it. And the instrumented mouthguard is a tool that allows us to measure head impacts and brain injury potential, for want of a better word, exposure to the risk factors. And that plays out in seconds when a player has a big impact on the field, and it plays out in years when a player is one day 60 years old and wants to understand exactly what their career involved in terms of head impacts. And so I hope that I can make you realize and persuade you that the way that the mouthguard is used currently, part of the concussion tool, is the smallest piece of the picture. There is a much bigger picture, and that's what we actually have to work towards. So where are we with that picture now, right? So these are some of the competitions, not all of them, but we now have instrumented mouthguards in the global game, in women's competitions in Europe and North America, men in North America, URC competitions. It is in South America as well. As you know, it's in France, it's in Japan, and it's in Australia and New Zealand. The picture we have that we've analyzed, and we obviously are analyzing every competition, but we'll take this next few months to catch up. If you want to know how many head acceleration events does a player have in a match, men's competitions in black, women's are in purple. On average, there are about 20 to 22 head accelerations per player per match. So that's what a typical elite rugby player can experience, is 20 to 22 head impacts in a game. On women, it's about 30% lower, and it ends up being at about 14, the same in the international and the domestic game. If we ask how many of those are big, so now we're looking for significant, very high head impacts, above 40 Gs, that number comes up to just under 1 in the men's game and just under 0.3 in the women's game. So women players are much less likely to experience head accelerations that are small and that are large. So the picture that we currently have, and it really hasn't changed over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, is that on average, players will experience 21 to 22 head accelerations per match. Just under 5 will measure 20 Gs, and just under 1, as I've just shown you, will measure 40 Gs. So we're working on a 25-1, all medium, large. That's our current number. Now, as you would know from your club game and the elite game, the mouthguard was introduced as part of concussion diagnosis and management on the sideline in the form of these alerts. And so your match day doctor would receive an alert on an iPad telling him that a player, James Long, has experienced a significant head impact and needs to come off the field for an assessment. So far, in 449 elite matches, and this was in March this year, there have been 261 alerts. So that works out at, let's call it 6 every 10 matches. So it happens less often than once a match. When we introduced it, our target was that at most, we were going to have 1 per match. So where we are now at 0.6 per match, we're quite happy with that situation. What it means is that we currently have 1 alert every 1,122 head accelerations. So that alert threshold, when the matchday doctor gets a notification, is literally a 1 in 1,000 event. It doesn't happen all the time, and the sport is not pulling players off the field for no reason. It happens 1 in 1,000 impacts because they are the biggest of the biggest of the biggest impacts. And if per team, it works out that any given team will have 1 alert every 3.4 matches, and any given player will have 1 alert every 52 matches. So we don't think at this point that that is disrupting the game. We're very careful about that because we understand that if it happens 2 or 3 times a game, and if the same player is coming off every 10 matches, then we have a big problem. But where we've put this threshold is so high that it's a 1 in 1,000, it's 1 every 3.5 matches for the whole team, and it's 1 every 52 matches for the player. And so we're quite comfortable and happy where that is, and it's creating 1 additional assessment every 3 matches. So that is not going to change. We're quite happy with it. The point I want to emphasize very strongly is that this alert is not meant to diagnose a concussion. All it's doing is putting a player who's experienced a 1 in 1,000 head impact in front of the doctor so that they can have a check. It's a cautious approach to managing head injuries and head impacts. But we are obviously also tracking how often the mouthguard does pick up concussions, because that is interesting to look at. It's not the purpose, but it's interesting. And this is the data from January, February this year. We've got another 300,000 from top 14, from URC, from Premiership, from Super Rugby that are being added to this. But this is the bit that's been analyzed. So what you're looking at here is 94 concussions in 155,000 head acceleration events. And you can see straight away that the concussions, which are these dark red squares, tend to happen at much higher acceleration levels, angular on the y-axis, linear on the x-axis. Your typical head acceleration is 10.7 Gs. So half of all head acceleration events are lower than that, and half are higher. The typical concussion is 67.3 Gs, which corresponds to the 99.8th percentile. So concussion is much more likely when the head accelerations are larger. And that's what the distribution looks like. So there you can see on the top, this is all head acceleration events, and on the bottom are the concussions. And you can see that the concussions happen at very high angular linear accelerations. But that said, we can zoom in on this a little bit, it's really interesting because concussions are more likely when the acceleration is larger. Look at all these on the left side. These impacts show us that concussions do happen when head accelerations are smaller. So we have this group here on the right. These are single high magnitude events that have caused a concussion, the squares. It's interesting to look how many times these large impacts don't cause a concussion. So there's lots of complexity here. But what we're really interested in, these ones on the bottom left, because these are low magnitude events that cause a concussion. And our theory is that these players who get concussed at low head accelerations might have experienced many other head impacts in the game. And as a consequence of the cumulative effect of brain strain, they are susceptible to concussions even at low head accelerations. And so that's a big question for us to answer next. So what are those next steps? Pixels, Mouthguards, concussion removals, head injury assessments, and so on. But we need the grids and the frames, and that's what Ben is going to take over from me and do next. So we've moved from the pixels, even though we still collect them all, and now we're trying to understand what does the data actually mean. And this includes how do we apply Mouthguard data to, number one, load management, because if you understand that the Mouthguard is measuring head accelerations, which are caused by head impacts, you've now got a tool that measures contact load more accurately than anything we've ever had. And then secondly, what is the head impact risk? Some players have higher head acceleration numbers than others, and we need to understand what it is that makes them different. Why do they have this increased head acceleration number? And that's what Ben is going to take over from me with now. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over to Ben specifically so that he can talk to you about some of his really cool research that will start answering some of those questions. Thanks, Ben. Back to you.
So where are we now and what's next? So let's go back to the Rubik's Cube. The Rubik's Cube where everybody's got a slightly different view and we've not quite got our colours aligned. And before I progress into this next part, I'll just acknowledge the work of James Tooby, Dr. Greg Rowan, Dr. Tom Sawchuk, who I stole most of these slides from. So if we think about head acceleration events and we think about the distribution, and Ross touched on this, if we had a normal distribution, okay, where we had some players on average have the mean amount and some have lower than average and some have higher than average, that makes sense, okay? But what we actually see in the data is we see this skew. Most players have a low number of head acceleration events. So this is simulated data, but this basically shows that most players have about 3 head acceleration events around 25G on average. And it shows that nearly 85% of players have 6 or less head acceleration events in a match. So most players are low. But what we did when we simulated this and then we checked this out against some real data that we had, whilst the average was around 3 head acceleration events and 1 standard deviation was 6 head acceleration events, there was one player in our data set that had 19 head acceleration events, 2 players that had 17, 2 players that had 16. So you can see how most players are low, but some are outliers. And then you start to think about, well, what do you do with this data? And then you start to think about a player, take a centre, and the green is the average number of head acceleration events, the orange is 1 standard deviation above average, the red is 2 standard deviations. And in some matches, they're normal. In some matches, they're 1 standard deviation above, and in some matches, they're 2 standard deviations above. So how do we manage these players? And then one of the challenges we do have that we acknowledge is that instrumented mouthguards are new technology, and sometimes they don't work. Sometimes people don't charge them, sometimes the devices are faulty, and sometimes players put them in their socks. So if we're going to start thinking about this from tracking players and looking at individual head acceleration events, we need to start thinking about, well, what do we do with the missing data, and how do we account for that? So what we've started to do is we've started to use imputation, that if we know an individual player's probability of a head acceleration event based on a tackle, a carry, a ruck, a maul, and we have all the video data, you can start to impute what you would estimate that to be. So these are all hypothetical scenarios. So we can get to a world where we can precisely monitor individual head acceleration events and track outliers. And then let's go back to the player who had played 30 matches and had different number of head acceleration events each match. If you provide different statistical rules, they can flag at different scenarios. So they may flag if they're 1 standard deviation above, 2, 3, etc. Now, what you'll notice is I've not spoken about anything in terms of clinical significance or clinical relevance, which we don't know yet. But actually, what we can start to think about is if we know the data and we know the distribution, and we can start to outline and highlight outliers, we can manage those. But this does move us to a position of average versus individual. And for anyone that's interested, there's a fantastic book called The End of Average. And it provides different scenarios of where when you take lots of measures to provide an average, the average fits to nobody. So there's an example when the US military took the measurements of over 4,000 pilots, 10 dimensions to make the perfect seat, the average perfect seat. How many pilots do you think it fit? 0. So we've got to think about this end of average when we start to think about the precision that the instrumented mouthguard can provide. So if you take what makes an average player, and we actually end up with averages of averages of averages of averages, because we're thinking about average minutes, average carries, average tackles, average rucks, average contact, average technique, average position, average size, etc. So you can see how, from a player level, there's so much more that we can do with the instrumented mouthguard. And we've shown in some of our research, similar to the distribution, that on average, individual players have much more head acceleration events than others. So this is the data that's zoomed in here is from the Premiership. So there's a centre in the Premiership that has an average of 8 head acceleration events per match. There's also some players, centres, that have an average of less than 1 per match. And the average for everybody else is 3. So we really need to start thinking about how we look at these players. And the more detailed graph on the right-hand side just shows the range on average per different position at different competitions. So one of those reasons may be the probability of a player receiving or causing a head acceleration event when they're a carrier or a tackler. So if we look at the x-axis here, this is the probability that a player will get a head acceleration event as a tackler. And it's about 4%. Okay? So as a tackler, my probability of getting a head acceleration event in the tackle is about 4%. And as a carrier, my probability is about 6%. Make sense? These are 25G. Okay? They're real players now. So actually, there's a player that has a probability of getting a head acceleration event 20% of times as a ball carrier and over 30% of the times as tackler. So you can really start to think about how we can identify individuals and start to modify risk factors, which could be physical and could be technical. And this doesn't account for the number of carries or tackles or exposure that they're involved in, which would further elevate those differences. And this is a similar scenario, but along the x-axis here actually shows something else. And this shows a player's probability of inflicting a head acceleration event on the opposition. So the vertical is receiving as a tackler or ball carrier, and the x-axis is inflicting. So we can start to identify different players and what they're doing to other players, as well as what players are doing to themselves. And we can really start to move the dial in terms of, if we know that players are different, what are the differences? And why are those players with lower head acceleration events, what are they doing different? Which is really important to identifying our risk factors as well. So just as a practical example of what this could mean and whether it's important, if we take, so this is based on weight, so a ball carrier's probability of getting a head acceleration event based on their weight and the tackler's weight. So if the ball carrier and the tackler are an average body mass, their probability of a head acceleration event to the ball carrier is 32%. Okay, these are all head acceleration events. If the ball carrier is lighter and the tackler is heavier, the probability is 37%. And if the ball carrier is heavier and the tackler is lighter, the probability is 27%. Now, this does become almost philosophical along the x-axis around the importance of head acceleration events. How important are those differences in terms of percents? Because these aren't clinical thresholds. These are just saying somebody may get more or may get less. And we can see that we can see similar differences to the tackler, whether the ball carrier's heavier or lighter. But we do see bigger differences to the ball carrier based on tackler weight than the other way around. So you can see where the future actually can start to go to in terms of modelling and simulating different scenarios based on different individuals' weight, because we've never been able to do this with concussion before, because concussions are so rare, where actually we now know that 1 in 2 tackles, we get a head acceleration event, so we can start to model this based on the global data. So we probably are still at a space where the Rubik's Cube is still being turned to try and line these colours up. Some people are probably more confident in the mouthguard than others, and some people are probably more concerned around the impact of subclinical head acceleration events on long-term outcomes than others. But one of the critiques of everything that I presented today has been I've cherry-picked a small part of the data from the mouthguard, the peak resultant acceleration. Imagine when we actually start to use the data as it's meant to be used, where we can start to look at location of impact, we can start to simulate brain strain, and we can really start to progress this beyond the resultant data which I presented. Once we get to this point, and then we start to include the clinical data as well, I really think that's when the Rubik's Cube is going to align. But I think the opportunities before this are, everybody would agree that a player that has more head impacts or more head acceleration events than others should try and reduce those. We as researchers don't know why yet. People on the ground will probably see the answer before we do, because you see your players more than we do. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity for early career researchers or practitioners to start to explore and be innovative and creative around what are the potential reasons. So hopefully that's given you an understanding of instrumented mouthguards and where we are on the journey of trying to reduce head acceleration events. Thank you.
Ok, donc moi c'est Olivier Chaplain, organisateur de séminaires et responsable, on va dire, référent Protège-Dents Instrumentés à la Fédération Française de Rugby. Je vous fais un bilan de ce qui a été recueilli pour la détection des commotions en top 14 sur la saison. Les données en fait viennent de Stéphanie Raoul des Essarts qui travaille à la FFR pour l'analyse des données associées aux commotions pour la Ligue nationale de rugby. Comme on vous l'a présenté, en fait, le Protège-Dents Instrumentés a été imposé pour les compétitions élites et dans le top 14 depuis cette saison. Alors, vous connaissez peut-être le protocole HIA1 qui a lieu, qui est associé à l'évaluation en cours de match. Le principe, c'est qu'on a des signes de critère 1 qui sont strictement associés à une commotion, à un joueur qui reste au sol plusieurs secondes. La sortie est immédiate et permanente. Et puis, il y a des signes plus faibles, comme des signes qu'on appelle signes de critère 2, dont je ne connais pas la liste, mais ils mènent à une évaluation en bord de terrain par un médecin. Et donc, depuis peu, les protèges-dents instrumentés, donc en anglais c'est IMG, en français c'est PDI, protèges-dents instrumentés, quand on dépasse certains seuils d'accélération linéaire et d'accélération angulaire. Donc, ça mène à la même évaluation. Donc, le critère 2 et l'alerte PDI sont utilisés de la même manière. On sort le joueur, on l'évalue cliniquement, et donc il retourne au jeu ou pas. Et alors ces données, elles sont, en fait, l'évaluation se fait sur une application qui s'appelle Scrum ou SCRM, qui est utilisée dans tous les pays, à ma connaissance, qui sont soumis au protocole HIA1. Et donc c'est les données qui ont été recueillies sur Scrum que je vais vous présenter. Voilà. Alors, le recueil en top 14 a été fait à partir de la journée 7. Et là, je vous présente des données qui ont été recueillies jusqu'au barrage du top 14. Donc, sur la période, le nombre de commotions confirmées est de 103. Et on a 48 alertes PDI. Donc, je vais vous décrire... en fait, l'intérêt du PDI en analysant ces alertes, le résultat de ces alertes. Donc, en colonne, on voit des alertes qui ont donné lieu à une commotion. Donc, en tout, c'est 17 alertes qui sont associées à une commotion et 31 qui ne sont pas associées à une commotion. Par contre, il y a des alertes aussi sur les lignes. On voit qu'il y a des alertes qui sont associées aussi à un critère visuel, 1 ou 2. Et cette ligne nous intéresse moins. Nous, ce que je vais commenter là, c'est juste l'intérêt du PDI uniquement, des alertes qui n'ont pas été vues en cours de match. Il n'y a pas d'autres signes qui ont été vus. Donc ça concerne 37 alertes. Et sur ces 37 alertes, on a eu 9 commotions confirmées. Donc on peut dire que ça, c'est vraiment l'apport du protège-dents. C'est 9 commotions confirmées sur 103 en tout. Donc on va dire que c'est un apport limité, mais loin d'être nul, parce qu'il y a 9 joueurs qui ont été sortis du terrain grâce aux protège-dents instrumentés en top 14 cette saison. On remarque par exemple que par contre, donc c'est 9 sur 37, c'est pas un taux énorme, et en fait on peut considérer que le protège-dents instrumenté n'est qu'une brique additionnelle au protocole tel qu'il est. Comme le disait Ross, il n'a jamais été question de faire du protège-dents instrumenté un outil de diagnostic de commotion. Voilà. Et sinon, on peut remarquer aussi qu'en fait, il y a donc 28 alertes négatives en 142 matchs, ce qui n'est pas, comment dire, une détérioration du jeu qui est si importante que ça. C'est assez limité. Et comme le disait Ross, à la base, ça a été fait pour être une alerte par match. On est largement en dessous. Non, pardon, c'est faux de dire ça parce qu'il faudrait prendre toutes les alertes. On est 48 en 142, mais on est quand même très loin du 1 pour 1. J'espère que ce n'est pas dû à un taux de port de protège-dents plus faible en France qu'ailleurs, mais bon, ça, je ne sais pas trop. Mais ça, je présente quand même des challenges associés au déploiement des protège-dents. En termes d'acceptation par les joueurs, il y a des questions de personnalisation de protège-dents, des joueurs qui ont des besoins particuliers. Comment on peut intégrer une puce qui détecte bien les commotions et qui protège bien ces joueurs qui ont des besoins particuliers. Il y a un défi logistique pour faire en sorte que tous les joueurs soient équipés. À chaque changement de version de Protège-Dents, chaque changement de club, etc., il y a des joueurs qui passent d'équipe de France ou de sélection de manière générale au club. C'est un vrai défi logistique. Il y a des questions de... Pardon, j'ai un problème de transmission des alertes. Les alertes ne sont pas immédiates, c'est généralement en quelques minutes, mais il y a des ratés, il y a des questions de transmission d'alerte qui posent problème. Et puis, il y a la question des grandeurs physiques les plus pertinentes. Est-ce que l'accélération linéaire et l'accélération rotationnelle, est-ce qu'on ne peut pas faire mieux? C'est le dernier point de la présentation de Ben. À la fois pour la détection des commotions, bien sûr, et le monitoring de la charge. Et puis, il y a une question, comment on peut donner de la valeur à ces données de manière plus générale? Pour reprendre les termes de Ross, comment on peut parler d'autre chose que là, il s'agit de pixels, on va dire, et de manière générale, comment on donne de la valeur à ces données pour l'entraînement, etc. Voilà, merci à vous. Je laisse la main, Ross, if you can, Ben, please, if you can come back on stage.
Voilà, on voulait prendre quelques minutes pour montrer que c'est une technologie très récente, qui a eu un impact fort même et contraignant, mais que grâce à cette technologie, en moins d'une saison, on a pu identifier 9 commotions qui n'auraient pas été vues. Il en suffisait que d'une pour, à mon avis, montrer l'intérêt de cette technologie. Voilà. So, questions?
I have a question for the first speaker. So you mentioned the IMG as higher precision and recall statistics than standard method, but you didn't mention what were the precision and recall of the standard method. So what were they, and how much better are we with IMG than with other techniques to detect the head accelerations?
Yeah, good question. So the most commonly used measure in the literature is the American football hit system, which is based on sensors and video tracking in helmets. We know that the helmets can move. We know helmets can move independent to the skull, so they can rotate. So we know that they're good for counting in terms of the number of. They're not good for the magnitude because they move independent. Same with skin patches. So the X-patch skin patch was probably was commonly used before Mouthguards. If you put your finger on your neck, your skin moves independent again to your head. So in terms of, I'm not sure of the numbers in top of my head, but one of the things that the Mouthguard does do, which we've not been able to do before, is previously sensors all needed video verifying because they gave lots of false positives, because any time that somebody moved, the sensor would record a head impact, so you would need to video verify whether that was actually seen. Because of the gum shield, because of how it has an infrared sensor on the teeth, so you can make sure it's actually in the mouth. If the gum shield is actually in the mouth on the teeth, because the teeth are fixed to the skull, the head had to move for the sensor to move. So they're all the more specific advances. In terms of exact numbers, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I should know, but I don't.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. And we know that IMGs are a game changer, and we have a lot of things could be done now that we cannot expect a few years ago. As you know, that the professional players are selected because they are outliers regarding their, let's say, the classical population. And so they don't really face an impact the same way. There is some people with, let's say, 80 kilos on the field, and someone who are 100 and whatever. So there is a need, to my point of view, of personalization of the criteria, What are your insights? You speak about it a bit, but what are the next steps to adapt maybe the criteria to the player?
Ross, do you want to answer that in terms of the individual threshold?
Yeah, if I understand correctly, you're asking whether we're going to look at individualized thresholds, for instance, to remove a player.
Yes, that's what
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. At this stage, I don't think that that can happen accurately. And the reason is, if you remember, I showed a graph of the concussions in amongst all the other head accelerations, and you had this massive spread. Sometimes you have a concussion on the top right, and other times you have a concussion on the top left, and so on. To me, it seems that there is so much individual variability between and within a player that I don't think that an individual threshold will add any more diagnostic accuracy to the process than having one threshold for all players. It's definitely something we want to explore. It might be that by the time we've had 1,000 concussions and 1 million head accelerations, we start to work out that some players, maybe by position group, maybe it's based on their size, we can maybe start looking at saying that the threshold at which the player needs to be removed or not changes. But at the moment, based on the sample size we've got, given the complexity and the confounding factors, the effect of cumulative head acceleration events, the individual differences within and between players, I don't think that it's going to be possible to say that this player's threshold is here and another player's threshold is there. I think it would be guesswork, to be honest, at this point.
And if, not in a clinical sense, but in terms of individual thresholds and individual kind of outliers, and this is rugby league data, not rugby union, but when we first started to visualise which players were having more or less, obviously we do this first of all based on like data points, and then you have to go back and you have to look at names to actually find out who they are. And I was nervous that the top right, who have a lot, were going to be the best players. So I was going to have to tell the best players to stop tackling as hard. And the bottom ones were the worst players, but it wasn't that. The players that were top right were the players that I had to Google and find out who they actually were and where they played. Whereas the players that were actually more bottom left were the elite international players. So actually that's been a really positive message around you're not telling your best players to not tackle as hard. There's something more complex going on.
I have a question for you. All the graphs that you presented were based on the peak acceleration, both angular and linear, but you did not. Did you have a chance to take a look if the direction has an effect? Because I saw that you've got a finite element model, but in the car industry, we see that when applying acceleration to the head, the strain in the brain is not the same depending on the direction. Did you have a chance to take a look at the data that you got from the field?
No, we haven't looked at that yet. The honest answer is, like, we're drowning in data. So we've tried the simplest way to present the data, therefore we've gone for the peak resultant acceleration. But you're right, in terms of there's so many different brain strain models and computational models which account for different factors, both direction, area under the curve, previous impact, but we haven't looked at that yet. Do you want to mention anything from Bioco, Ross?
Yeah, thanks. We're also drowning, but what we've got is luckily a couple of people who are willing to collaborate. And so literally 2 weeks ago, we sent 400,000 head accelerations and 200 concussions to a group that works out of Virginia Tech in the United States. And they've been involved in the car industry, which I assume you know about based on your question, and also in working out other metrics in NFL and American football. And so they look at a number of different things. Obviously, they look at peak linear acceleration, peak angular. They look at the change in velocity. They look at the location where the impact happens, so the direction. Plus, there's the time under which the acceleration happens. So our Mouthguard calls it workload. It's a energy transfer metric. And they've got different metrics. They call one of them damage, one of them's called harm. And so that group is looking at our data with all the possible measurements that the Mouthguard collects. And they will, if it comes out in the next 3 months that we should be using time, direction, and peak linear, then that's what we'll start using based on their data. So we are looking at it. It's just taking a lot longer than we maybe hoped.
And also to build on that, I don't think it's going to be long work before people start triangulating the kinematic data with then biomarkers as they progress, with then clinical outcomes. So I think whilst advancing the instrument to Mouthguard and kinematic data, it's still kinematic data. We need to then start looking at other measures as well. And I don't think they're going to be far away in terms of kind of where this journey's at.
And I have one more question for Ben. In your first slide, you had two differences between men rugby and women rugby. So if I remember well, women were more positive about their perception of the tool, the IMG. And later on, you had figures where, well, the difference was small, but still the device were less performant for women detection than for men detection. Do you have an idea why, or element that could understand this difference?
Yeah, good question. So there was two. So those were two different things. So the first validation study that we did, we only used Academy Rugby League players, male Academy Rugby League players. And that was for convenience because everyone knows it's easy to get Academy players to do things that they don't want to do compared to senior players. So the validity study of instruments in Mouthguards was done on Academy Rugby League players. But obviously there was widespread use across rugby union, rugby league, men and women. So the validity study that we then followed up with looked at those four groups separately: male rugby league, male rugby union, women rugby league, women rugby union, and we didn't see any differences in those. So they were very similar. So whilst those numbers are slightly different in terms of the positive predictive values and the sensitivity, we're confident to say that the Mouthguard performs similar for those different cohorts. So we're happy about that. The slide that looked at the differences in terms of the interest, that was based on instrumented Mouthguard users' perceptions of interest. So the person who was managing the Mouthguard in the team. It probably doesn't surprise us that the women were more interested than the men in terms of like new research projects, and it probably didn't surprise us that male rugby league players were the least interested because they're probably a bit more reckless in their approach to some things. So that didn't surprise us. So yeah, so the Mouthguard does perform the same regardless of sex or code. And the women were more interested in the new technology than the men were.
Well, first, thanks for women information about women athletes. Second, just as a rebound, what about the helmets? You talked about American football helmets. Are girls, are women more likely to use helmets? With captors. And my second question is about the plan you showed, talking about the best athletes who were not on the right up corner. Does it mean that they built a behavior to avoid impact? Or is it intuitive for them? So these are my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah. So if I answer the first question around helmets, you mean like so soft headgear, so headgear. To my knowledge, and we've got a paper under review at the moment, any study that's looked at headgear and concussions or head injuries doesn't show a protective benefit. So we haven't seen that around concussion or head injuries. I don't think anybody yet has started to evaluate headgear against head acceleration events, because is that correct, Ross? Your understanding?
I haven't seen it, so
yeah.
I think you're right.
But I know that now instrumented mouthguards are more common. People are starting to think about ways in which you could do that. I know the AFL, they were also exploring something around, different players wearing them first half, second half, to actually do well-designed studies to see whether it does attenuate the impact. But those studies haven't been done or completed yet, to my knowledge. So that's the first part. The second one, in terms of what specifically causes the player to be top right or top left, I honestly don't know yet. I think it's quite complex. The observations of the players that we saw, and this has been very simple, they were younger players, which is why I didn't know who they were. They were younger players who were playing in forward positions, so positions that had a lot of contacts. But in terms of like when we've looked at some of this instrumented mouthguard data, especially the video analysts that take a lot of time coding, they often see things differently than we do. So they'll show a big impact, a big instrumented mouthguard impact, and we'll all look at each other and they'll say, no, that player's head hit their elbow, so that the tackler's head hit the ball carrier's elbow. That's where that came from, rather than what we see, which is the big collision and the sweat come off, and actually both players are braced, and that didn't result in a big head impact. So I think it's, to Ross's point around the instrumented mouthguard being a new trigger for a HIA assessment, I think it's introducing us to things that we couldn't see with the eye before. So I think it'll start to uncover new things for us to start to mitigate as well.
Okay, thank you. I have maybe a more global question. Must we show IMG data to players and today? And for example, after every match or every training, like as we could do with another data like GPS, it's a real debate with my colleagues, and I would like to have your opinion.
I'll let Ross go first.
I would encourage everyone to engage and use data as much as possible, but I'm biased because I'm a scientist, so for me data is king always. But the short answer to your question is I hope so, yes. I think you just have to explain to the players what it is you're showing them, and I'm not 100% sure we're there yet. I mentioned, and I think Ben has also made the same point, that the mouthguard is in effect tracking contact load. So if you think of GPS as tracking running load and non-contact load, it also does have a contact accelerometer, but I think the mouthguard does that better. Then you've basically got a metric for contact load that you can share with players. Now, why would you do that? I think you could share that with them to try and address what Ben has identified as some players are high, some players are low. Is that good? Do you want to manage the high player down? Do you want to manage the low player up? If you don't have that conversation with the players, then what would you be doing as a coach with the intervention? So I would encourage teams to open the conversation. I don't know if I would present the data and say, this is our leaderboard. These are the players who had the most. These are the players who had the fewest. I don't think that's the behavior you would want to change anyway. But if I had a player who played the same number of minutes as a teammate and who had 35% more head accelerations every week, I would be having a conversation with that player and trying to understand what's going on there.
And I think I'll use rugby league as an example because it's, I think this is more practical. Rugby league's different in terms of how this fits, and the main reason is that it doesn't have an international governing body. It doesn't have kind of different competitions. So actually, it's quite a contained. If you're talking about like who's responsible, it's quite contained. If that makes sense. So when we've discussed this in rugby league across the professional clubs, the CEOs are quite interested, because actually if the guiding principle here that more head impacts increases the player's risk later in life, and you knew that and nobody did anything, like the CEOs actually see that in terms of through the lens of risk, where the performance staff, and nobody's dismissive, I'm not saying that, the performance staff are managing lots of data streams, and they're manipulating lots of things in terms of minutes, in terms of rest, in terms of form, etc. But in terms of if within a team, the player is an absolute outlier if within the whole league, the player is an absolute outlier, and somebody knew that and didn't do anything about it, the CEOs were the people that actually became the most nervous. So I do think, I'm with Ross and I'm biased, I do think this data, for the first time ever, of all our data streams, is relevant to every single person, from CEO to coach to player to medic, and actually allows some solutions, more practical, to be discussed. So I would discuss those in a case level where, a CEO is probably not interested in GPS.
Okay, very clear. Thank you. Maybe last quick questions. 20 or 25G to analyze higher head acceleration events? That is the question.
I'll go first and I'll pass to Ross. Everybody always asks us this, and they say, why 20 or 25? And I think there's a risk. So there's a risk here that we agree on something too soon before knowing actually any reason why. Like Ross spoke about the 10G low, 20G, and then 40G high. Like actually, what Ross is presenting is lower, higher, and even higher. We don't. There's no threshold there. So the honest reason we use 25 genuinely is because 25 is 15 higher than 10. 40 is 15 higher than 25. 15 is 15 higher. 55 is 15 higher than 40. And in scientific studies, because there was no rationale for thresholding, it made sense to go 10, 25, 40, 55, and 70. Like that was the only reason we did it. And yeah, and then there's more nuance around. 20 or 25 starts to differentiate contact from non-contact sport athletes, but again, that's not a precise one. And then there is some studies in America that have simulated a potential trigger bias in the instrumented mouth guard, given that the mouth guard measures at the mouth but then transforms to head center of gravity. And 2025 is when you're confident that you're not going to get a linear trigger bias, but again, the precision's so I'm going to pass to Ross, who'll probably say something different.
Sorry, we did exactly the same thing as you, except we went 10, 20, 30, 40. But the thing is, it was arbitrary. I will say that no study yet has published something that said, here's a line at 25, if it's higher, it's bad. If it's low, it's good. No one's thinking like that. No one's thinking. No one said at 40. So in all the papers that we've published, we've presented everything from 10 all the way to 120, from 500 radians all the way to 10,000 radians per second squared. And I think for the next while, that's going to be how we present the data. We measure all of it because we don't know what it means when. And only in retrospect, maybe in 3 or 4 years, we'll be able to say that the biggest predictor of concussion in a player is how many head impacts they have above 25. Fine. Then we'll commit to measuring 25 Gs at that point. But I think right now we keep our options open.
And I think Ross makes a good point. If you look at any of the studies that we've collectively worked on together or individually, in a lot of those studies, there's reams and reams of data in the supplementary information for this point that we don't know how we want these studies to last, and we know that things will change, so we want the data to still be there. And really interesting that there was a critique of it was a World Rugby paper around why they didn't report data above a certain threshold, which wasn't true. It was it above 55 because the rates were so low that actually a lot of the data shows the number of head accelerations above 10G, above 20, above and above. And you get that when you go to high magnitudes, they're so rare that they're not on the graph. But it's a greater than, and then there was criticism around, well, you're not showing the 110G because they're the 1 in 2,000.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we need to stop this session if we would like to finish our conference before tomorrow. Thank you very much, Ross. Thank you very much, Ben. We are looking forward to seeing the future, and we are sure that will be a game changer, yes, for the Rugby Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. Merci.